right, good morning. Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to welcome those who are with us in person and also those who are joining us online. We appreciate you attending the news conference and listening to what we're going to talk about today. I'm Dave Boxon. I'm a communications specialist for the Minnesota Department of Public Safety. What we're talking about today is a very important pilot project. It's about keeping people safe from the dangers of drug-impaired driving. We're going to hear from three people today. We have Mike Hansen. He's the Office of Traffic Safety Director. We have Officer Jake Cree. He's a drug recognition evaluator, or DRE, with the Blaine Police Department. And we have Colonel Christina Bogoyevich. She's the Minnesota State Patrol Chief. We also have Sergeant Tyler Millis with the Minnesota State Patrol. He coordinates a DRE program for Minnesota, and he'll be help to answer any questions related to the pilot project and enforcement efforts. After they speak, we'll open up to some media Q&A, so I just ask out of courtesy for the speakers and the folks that are watching online to please introduce yourself, your name, and the organization that you're with. And with that, I'll turn it over to Director Mike Hansen.
Thank you, Dave, and good morning, everybody. And again, thank you once again for joining us today for what I think is an important piece of information that we want to share with all Minnesotans. My name is Mike Hansen, H-A-N-S-O-N. I have the privilege of serving as the Director for the Department of Public Safety's Office of Traffic Safety. We're talking today about the deadly seriousness of impaired driving related to drugs and the combination of drugs and alcohol that is currently taking place on Minnesota roadways. The Office of Traffic Safety conducted a pilot project last year that could lead to new roadside screening tools that could keep Minnesota roads safe. And is an important tool for our law enforcement partners across the state to help them be more effective at interdicting and detecting those drug-impaired drivers. The tools are called oral fluid testing instruments, and they can help law enforcement identify drug-impaired drivers. We submitted a report on the pilot project's results to the legislators last week. We were very pleased with the results. I want to thank the Minnesota legislature for providing the resources to conduct the study on two instruments and to prepare the report that we submitted. I'm going to share some of the report highlights with you right now. Drug recognition evaluators from law enforcement agencies across Minnesota participated in the pilot project last year. They tested two instruments, the Abbott SoToxa oral fluid mobile test system and the Dräger DrugTest 5000 instrument. They evaluated the instruments for factors such as the ease of use, reliability, accuracy, and practicality. The devices detect recent use of 6 different drug classes and the specific chemicals that can impair drivers, including tetrahydrocannabinol, which is the cannabinoid that can impair driving that is found in cannabis products. The pilot project was voluntary for drivers. The DRE would first perform a standardized set of roadside evaluations of drivers who were suspected of being under the influence of a controlled substance. Once the arrest had been effected by the DRE, the subject who had been arrested was asked if they would be willing to voluntarily participate in the pilot project and help us to evaluate these instruments. At that point, they were asked if they would be willing to submit an oral fluid sample for evaluation and testing. And they were informed at that point that the results of that oral fluid test could not be used to form the probable cause for the arrest, could not be used in a criminal prosecution, and could not be used for any driver's license sanction. It was simply a voluntary participation in the project. The results showed how prevalent and disturbing the simultaneous use of multiple substances is to driving impairment. During the pilot project, we detected drugs in 87.2% of the tests overall. The most frequently detected substances were cannabinoids, methamphetamines, and amphetamines. The pilot project, and this is one that kind of worries me from a traffic safety perspective, we detected more than one drug in 62% of these tests, more than one drug over half the time. And we found that 90% of drivers who tested positive for alcohol with a preliminary breath test also tested positive for one or more drugs at the same time. The project clearly showed that the instruments accurately detected the same substances that the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, the BCA, found in its laboratory tests. Most match rates exceeded 82% when the oral fluid test was compared with the laboratory blood or urine test. Since our results report just came out, legislators, traffic safety advocates, and others interested in safety on our roads now need time to review the report. If it's determined that the instruments would be a welcome, valuable additional traffic safety tool, legislative approval will be required for the devices to be used by law enforcement across the state. Law enforcement officers beyond the DRE trained officers would then be able to use the devices to screen drivers at roadside. This would expand the ability to stop drug-impaired driving, and a wider scope of troopers, deputies, and police officers could then have the screening tools to help them establish probable cause for that impaired driving arrest. We're excited about what these testing instruments could mean for keeping you and your family safe on the road. Whether it's a quick trip to the grocery store, going to your kid's high school band concert, or driving to your favorite lake for camping, boating, or fishing, every person deserves to get to their destination safely all year, all the time, on all Minnesota roads. Now, to hear some firsthand experience about how the pilot project worked and what it could mean for traffic safety, I'm going to introduce Officer Jake Cree. He's with the Blaine Police Department. Officer Cree is a drug recognition evaluator who participated in the project and has some firsthand experience to share with you. Jake, all yours.
Hello, as Director Hanson advised, I'm Officer Jake Cree with the Blaine Police Department. I am also a drug recognition evaluator in the state of Minnesota. Just really briefly, if you're unfamiliar with what that is, it's just officers who have gone through pretty extensive advanced training in the detection of the effects that controlled substances have on the human body. For the past 2 years, I've served in the Blaine Police Department on our traffic unit as our DWI enforcement officer. And I had the opportunity last year to participate in this pilot project where I got to use both of our devices pretty extensively. The process for using both devices was, I felt, very intuitive and very simple to use, and the process was pretty streamlined. Just kind of a brief overview of how that looked, as Officer Hanson referred to. So we'd make that stop, and I would complete my normal DWI investigations with the standardized field sobriety tests. And then when I determined that I believe this was going to be a controlled substance DWI, then I would offer to the subject. And I had to make sure to advise them that it was a completely voluntary participation, that the results of the test couldn't be used in any way in any case against them, and that I couldn't know the results until after my investigation was completed. And then if they agreed to participate, which a vast majority of them did, then I would hand them the oral swab that comes with the testing devices. They would swab that inside their mouth for a period of time, and then I'd place that into the testing machine in order to get that test started, and then that would be a set aside while I completed the rest of my DWI investigation. Part of that investigation would include getting either a blood or a urine sample from the subject, and then when all of my investigation had been completed, then I could look and see what the results were. The results would show either a positive or a negative for the various different drug categories that are tested for there. If it tested positive, then the manufacturers advised that we're looking at they had used a substance in that category within the past 24 hours. Once I got the results, I sent them off to the project coordinators, and then I would send the blood or urine sample off to the BCA to get the chemical testing done there, and then when those results came back, the project also got a copy of those results, and those were compared. In all of my cases, I noticed that the devices tested the same as my lab results showed. So I felt like the process was very easy to use, and it was very accurate for everything that we needed it for. So in the state of Minnesota, we have a very serious problem with impaired driving, both in alcohol and in controlled substances. And what most people will agree with is that when you're actively drunk or actively high, that is a danger to be on the road. What a lot of people don't realize or don't understand is that after that euphoric high for, like, let's say cannabis, for example, after that 10 to 20 minute high has subsided and you're no longer feeling the effects of those drugs, your body is still undergoing a lot of effects from that. Some of those can be inability to divide your attention, inability for your eyes to focus on one point, which can be a pretty big hazard when you're driving down the highway and you got people coming from different directions. And then just a big one with THC is the impairment of your perception of time. I've had some people with some wildly accelerated and wildly delayed perceptions of time, which obviously when you're driving down the freeway or passing crosswalks, that's a huge problem. I think these devices will be extremely helpful for law enforcement officers around our state to help us make the streets and the roads safer for all of us to enjoy. Thank you.
Colonel?
Good morning. I'm Christina Bogoyevich, and I have the honor of serving as the Colonel of the Minnesota State Patrol. As one of the state's leading traffic enforcement and safety agencies, we're proud to have had the opportunity to participate in this groundbreaking pilot program and to find more methods to detect drug-impaired driving. While we are pleased with the positive results of this pilot, we also want to share this message with Minnesotans today. Impaired is impaired, and driving high is a DWI. You don't need a test to tell you it is never okay to get behind the wheel if you are under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Our troopers see every day how the choice to drive impaired can end badly in so many ways. Getting arrested for driving while impaired is not just a simple traffic citation. It's a crime that can cost you thousands of dollars, a loss of a driver's license, and possible jail time. That's the best possible outcome. At least you're alive, and no one else was harmed because of an easily preventable decision. What's far worse is seeing what happens to victims, offenders, and families because of a fatal crash or serious injury crash, all because someone thinks they're okay to drive after drinking or consuming drugs. The number of people who decide to risk their lives and lives of others by driving high is far too many. A survey just released by AAA this month shows 85% of cannabis consumers reported driving the same day they used cannabis. 53% said they used cannabis an hour or less before driving. 81% of them falsely believed their driving was the same or better after using cannabis. And sadly, here in Minnesota, driving while impaired by drugs or a combination of drugs and alcohol is not a new problem. And it's not getting any better. Drug driving accounted for more than 8,000 driving while impaired or DWI incidents from 2013 to 2017. That compares with nearly 16,000 from 2018 to 2022. These perceptions and habits need to change. That's why we're committed to education, enforcement, and leading the statewide Drug Recognition Evaluator, or DRE, training program. The Office of Traffic Safety and the Minnesota State Patrol work together on implementing the oral fluid drug testing pilot project to determine if this tool law enforcement can use to detect if a driver is under the influence of drugs. While the methods we may use to take impaired drivers off the road is always evolving, our message to the public is simple and never changes. Consuming alcohol, cannabis, prescription medications, and other illegal substances can affect safe driving abilities and lead to tragedy. Your reaction time is slower, your understanding of distance is different, and the coordination required to drive a vehicle is impaired. Bottom line, if you feel different, you drive different. At the Minnesota State Patrol, our #1 commitment is keeping people safe on the road, but we can't do this alone. We need the help of everyone who gets behind the wheel. Always plan for a safe and sober ride to protect yourself and other people on the road. You can help us ensure that every Minnesotan gets home safely at the end of the day.
All right, thank you. So now we'll open it up for a media Q&A. I just remind again, please introduce yourself and the organization you're with, and we'll have the appropriate folks answer the questions.
How many false positives did you guys get on this testing?
The question is, how many false positives did we have as a part of this project? Anytime you're evaluating technology, there always is the danger that that's going to happen. However, we had enough safeguards built into this, and the technology is well developed to avoid those false positives. What the instruments do detect is recent use of the 6 categories of drugs that the instruments are designed to detect. Specifically, when we're looking at cannabis, which I think is something that many people are interested in, it doesn't just look at is that cannabis or that cannabinoid present in the human body, but it's looking for the active ingredient that causes a human being to be to have that high. It's delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, and that tends to burn itself out of the body in a relatively quick manner. But there is still the cannabinoid that remains in the body for some point after that. As far as specifically how many of those false positives, we don't have anybody from the BCA lab here. I can certainly check with them and get back to you on that. But I think it was a very, very small, if non-existent number.
Adam Buxer with WCCO Television. What's the ask now for our lawmakers in the state? How much an investment are you looking for, both in devices, and what would that cost?
Very good. The question is, what is our ask now that we've completed the pilot project, and what would the cost for that potentially be? Well, as I mentioned in my remarks, we've completed the report, we've submitted to the legislature, and so they're now examining and reviewing it, and then they will make the decision as far as what the next steps are going to be. As far as the actual cost, each of the instruments costs about $5,000 for us to purchase. And so, they're not inexpensive, but they are a very effective tool. Now, it doesn't cost $5,000 every time it's used. There is a cartridge that goes with it, and each test, that test cartridge costs about $25 or $30. And so there is a bit of a fiscal impact that would come with this. But again, those are part of the evaluation process that the legislature is undertaking right now.
In a perfect world, though, if you get what you want, from the state, how many of these are we buying? Who's using them? I'm just curious about that total investment. That would be ideal.
Okay, so again, the question is, what would we ask for and how many of them do we want? Well, the pilot project was deliberately constructed to use our drug recognition evaluators because they are the ones that are frequently in contact with a drug-impaired driver. However, the overall intent is to receive approval to use these roadside oral fluid units in the same way that law enforcement officers across the state use a preliminary breath test to evaluate somebody who is under the influence of alcohol. So ultimately, we would like to have these in the hands of those officers across the state. The DREs have a very high level of training, so they aren't the ones that necessarily need to have this type of instrument to confirm what they're observing. But the average street officer out there may not have that high level of training, and so this is just one other tool that they can use to reach that arrest, no arrest decision.
Mara Guthrie with the Pioneer Press. So just to be clear, following up on that, so if the legislature approves use of them, it could be probable cause for an arrest, and would it be used to get a search warrant, or would that not be needed?
Okay, so the question is, if these are approved, does a positive test constitute grounds for arrest or probable cause for that arrest? Probable cause is like a big jigsaw puzzle, and this is a piece of that jigsaw puzzle. So if we break down basic impaired driving incident, it involves driving conduct observed by the law enforcement officer, personal contact by the law enforcement officer. This is where they're starting to make those observations of signs of impairment. Standardized field sobriety testing, and then this tool, along with the PBT, can be implemented to confirm the officer's observations of impairment. And so this could form the grounds for the search warrant that it would help to form the grounds for that probable cause, which then forms the grounds for the application for the search warrant that law enforcement must obtain in order to get that body fluid sample. Does that answer your question, Maria?
I think so. And is there a bill that's been introduced this session, or has it been heard in committee?
There is no legislation currently active that I am aware of.
Not to get into the nitty-gritty, but for alcohol, there's a legal limit that a threshold that you meet. To clarify, these devices are simply testing for the presence, right? It's not a threshold of a presence. So for someone who is going to partake in something that's legal in Minnesota, say smoking weed, I guess the question is, as a driver, is if I smoke weed, when am I good to drive again? And how long will that stay in my body? Because I've heard from the people up on, even if you don't feel high, it could still be impacting you. So what's the best advice to drivers if they are going to smoke weed? When can they drive again?
Sergeant Millis, I'm going to defer to you on that one.
Good morning. My name is Tyler Millis. I have the privilege of serving as Minnesota's Drug Evaluation and Classification Program Coordinator, also known as the DRE program. The question was, when are people essentially safe to drive after consuming cannabis? And we'll just remind the viewers that if you feel different, you drive different. There is no correlation to a nanogram level or that per se level and the actual impairment being seen. When you get down to the nitty gritty of how cannabis works in the body, it is not very fluid and it is different from person to person. So the simple answer is if you feel different, don't drive. Find a sober ride, and if any point that you doubt your safety to drive, get a sober ride. Just don't drive.
If I can just add a little bit to Sergeant Millis's reply there. We have to look at drug-impaired driving through a little bit different paradigm than we look at alcohol-impaired driving. Alcohol is one of the most studied substances on the face of the earth. We know that it interacts with basically every human being in about the same way. When we talk about drugs and drug categories and different drug categories, they all interact with each of us in an individual way. And that's the biggest argument against having that per se or that measurable level where if you're over, you're over, if you're under, you're under. Because somebody who uses marijuana or a cannabis product infrequently may have a very low level of delta-9 in their system but still be impaired. But on the other hand, a regular user of a cannabis product could have a higher level of that THC in their body and not have that same level of impairment. And the same thing can be said for many of the other drugs that were being encountered out on the road.
I was also wondering from a law enforcement standpoint, when you see someone on the road that appears to be driving impaired, can you tell from their driving behavior whether they're impaired by alcohol or drugs, or is that something you have to investigate more?
Yeah, I'll go back to what the question was if an officer's on the side of the road, if they can tell if it's drugs or alcohol and kind of how that process looks. I'll go back to what Director Hansen said. It is just one piece of the puzzle. We have to look at the totality of the circumstances. Again, their driving conduct, their speech, their what the officer's observing in the car and from that person, and then back to standardized field sobriety, which is what we're going to start with in any event if it's drugs or alcohol. And then eventually that process continues and the officer will make a decision using tools that we're seeing today to figure out which road they're going to go down if it's alcohol or drugs.
Ian Russell from CARE. You had mentioned, obviously, the next steps is in the hands of the legislature. Do we have an anticipated start date or a date that we would like to see something like this out in use in officers' hands?
Again, because we just submitted the report to the legislature last week, they need time to evaluate it, to take a look at it, and to look at the policy implications of it. They need to look at the fiscal impact of it and all of that. So we don't have a real hard timeline on it. We know that based on the pilot project, the technology works. These are good, solid tools. And so now it will be up to our legislative and policymakers to decide how this is going to roll forward in Minnesota.
Just to clarify one thing, I briefly read through as y'all were talking. These tests aren't admissible like in a court setting, correct? You'd still have to go and get some sort of blood or urine sample. So if I'm a lawmaker and saying, well, if it still goes to a blood or urine sample, like what is the benefit of having this step of the process if it's going to be such a large investment? What's the hurt in saying, we got you for a DWI or on a breathalyzer, for alcohol, we're also going to request a blood or urine sample for drugs as well. Like, what is the benefit of having this tool?
Okay, so the question is, what is the benefit of this if we're already going to go after another test? Well, basically, the test that we're looking at, this, along with a PBT, is a screening device. It is not an evidentiary test. Okay, once the probable cause for the arrest is established and that search warrant is obtained in the case of a body fluid sample, then the evidentiary test is obtained. And in body fluid, that's going to be either a blood test or a urine test that is obtained after a judge signs a search warrant. In the case of an alcohol impaired arrest, that would be a breath test, which does not require that same search warrant process. So why do we want this when we know we're going to go after an evidentiary test? It's basically to help the officer identify that somebody is impaired and what they're likely impaired by. So, you know, the PBT, you know, the officers, yeah, you can smell the alcohol, the driver admits to drinking, and they have poor coordination and all of the rest of the stuff that goes together. Do you need to have that PBT result? Yes, you do, because that confirms that it is in fact alcohol that is causing that impairment. What commonly is occurring out there is alcohol and other substances are combined. And so being able to differentiate between the two can be an important part of preparing that case or processing the process that will be followed in order to obtain that evidentiary test.
Last question for me. For anyone who's administering these tests or doing these tests, did you ever run into a situation where someone was surprised or wasn't, you know, didn't realize they had this in their system? And
Yeah, so the question was, if we ever ran across a case where someone was surprised to find something in their system. I'll say personally, I did have a person experience that, and what I would chalk that up to is a lot of times people are taking a controlled substance that may be diluted or cut with other substances. So I had one where the person had admitted to using methamphetamines, and then when we gave them the test, it also came back for an opiate. And my only explanation for that is that they didn't know what they were getting. I mean, it's different than like even cannabis now or alcohol. They might not know where they're getting these things from, and they might not be getting them from a reputable source to get their substances.
Director, back to the legislature, is there a particular committee or committees that you submitted the report to?
The question is, what legislative committees did we deliver the report to? It was the House and Senate Transportation Committees that authorized the pilot and provided the resources for us to conduct that, and that is who we submitted the report to.
How much did the pilot program cost?
The pilot program in total cost just about $900,000. And that included purchasing instruments, the training time for all of the officers that participated in it, as well as the report preparation and the staff time, both at the State Patrol and within the Office of Traffic Safety.
Once the charging is, or is it an escalated charge if it's alcohol and something else? Like, you know, there's first, second, third, fourth, I don't know, maybe fifth, sixth, DUI. What does that look like?
The question is, does a multi-substance offense or something like that escalate the charging level? At the way the impaired driving law is written is it's under the influence of alcohol, a controlled substance, or a combination thereof. And so if impaired is impaired, as the Colonel alluded to, it's the same offense. So there is currently no enhancement for a multi-substance offense.
do we have one that we like more than the other?
Sergeant Millis?
The question was if there was one that officers liked more than the other. The simple answer to that is that we found that both of them work, and we're asking legislators to allow both of them to be used, and then we can let the departments choose their preference if they have one.
You mentioned the fiscal impact of this, about $5,000 per machine and then $25, $30 a cartridge. Is the money worth it, in your opinion? After doing this study for the past year, is the money worth it?
So the question is, would the fiscal impact, would the investment in this program be worth it? And I'll give you a very simple, direct answer. If we can save one life by deploying these things, it is absolutely worth every penny we invest in it.
So we'll take like one or two more questions. I thank you so much for the interest and for coming to the news conference today. So one or two more questions and we'll wrap it up. So otherwise, if we're good, all good? All right.
Okay, you just say and spell your first and last name again for me up there.
My last name is Cree, C-R-E-E, and Jake.
Jake. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you. Appreciate it.